She was the wealthy cattle baron's secret shame, a daughter scarred and cast aside. Traded like a sack of winter flour to a rugged mountain man, she expected a life of brutal servitude. Instead, in the freezing peaks of the Rockies, she found the one thing money couldn't buy. In the autumn of 1883, the city of Denver was a booming testament to newly minted fortunes, built on silver, cattle, and the relentless expansion of the railroad. At the pinnacle of this high society aristocracy sat Silas Caldwell, a cattle baron whose wealth was matched only by his ruthless ambition. His sprawling Victorian mansion on Capitol Hill was a place of polished mahogany, imported Italian marble, and glittering chandeliers. Yet, hidden away in the shadows of the upper corridors was a secret Silas could not bear to look upon: his eldest daughter, Beatrice. Beatrice Caldwell had not always been a pariah. As a young child, she possessed a delicate porcelain beauty. But when she was 8 years old, a horrific lantern fire in the estate's stables changed her life forever. While attempting to save a trapped foal, Beatrice suffered severe burns. The fire left a jagged, raised scar that stretched from her left temple down to her jawline, pulling the skin tight and forever altering the symmetry of her face. In a society that valued women solely as beautiful ornaments to be traded for political or financial alliances, Beatrice was deemed ruined. For 10 years, she lived as a ghost in her own home. Her stepmother, a vain woman named Clara, ensured Beatrice was excluded from every gala, dinner, and social call. Silas, who viewed his children merely as assets, regarded her with a cold, simmering disgust. She was a bad investment, a constant reminder of tragedy in a house that worshipped perfection. Down in the city, Silas's latest obsession was a massive stretch of timberline in the rugged San Juan Mountains. The railroad needed ties, and the timber on Black Bear Ridge was prime, untouched pine. There was only one problem. The land belonged to Gideon Hayes. Gideon was a mountain man, a solitary trapper and homesteader who had inherited the vast acreage from a reclusive uncle. He was a man of the wild, coming down to the mining towns only twice a year to trade furs for coffee, salt, and ammunition. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders like granite boulders and a thick, dark auburn beard, Gideon was a formidable figure. He had no use for Denver's high society, and he certainly had no use for Silas Caldwell's money. The fateful meeting took place in Silas's opulent downtown office. The air was thick with the smell of expensive cigars, but Gideon smelled of pine needles, wood smoke, and old leather. "I've offered you twice what that godforsaken mountain is worth, Hayes," Silas barked, leaning across his massive oak desk. "Name your price. Every man has one." Gideon stood by the window, looking out at the muddy streets with quiet disdain. "I don't want your banknotes, Caldwell. Paper don't keep the wind out when it drops to 30 below, and it don't chop wood. I ain't selling the ridge." Silas narrowed his eyes, his mind working furiously. "Then what do you want? Why hold on to a fortune you won't even spend?" Gideon turned, his piercing gray eyes locking onto the wealthy baron. "I need a partner, a wife. The winters up there are long, and a man gets to thinking too much in the quiet. I need a woman who ain't afraid of the cold, who can handle a rifle, tend a hearth, and survive. The soft ladies you parade around this town would freeze to death in a week. You find me a woman sturdy enough to endure the mountain, someone who won't run at the first sign of a blizzard, and I'll sign over the logging rights to the lower 40 acres. For a moment, the room was dead silent. Then a slow, predatory smile spread across Silas Caldwell's face. He didn't see a human being in need of companionship. He saw a loophole. "I have exactly what you need," Silas said smoothly, leaning back in his leather chair. "My eldest daughter, Beatrice. She is secluded. She is not one of these fragile society belles. She is sturdy, quiet, and accustomed to a harsh life of duty. She will not complain, and she will not run." Gideon, unaware of the sinister reality behind Silas's words, slowly nodded. "If she's willing, and she's as tough as you say, we have a deal. Have the papers drawn up." The transaction was completed with the stroke of a pen. Beatrice was sold for 2,000 acres of pine. The next morning, the heavy oak door of Beatrice's bedroom swung open. Silas stood in the doorway, his eyes fixed firmly on the wall to avoid looking at the scarred side of her face. "Pack your trunks," he commanded, his voice devoid of any paternal warmth. You are to be married. The wagon leaves at dawn tomorrow." Beatrice dropped the book she was reading, her heart plummeting into her stomach. "Married? Father, who would?" "A man who owns land I require," Silas interrupted sharply. "He lives up in the high country. It is a harsh place, suited for someone like you. Do not embarrass me, Beatrice. You finally have an opportunity to be of use to this family. Take it and never return." She did not cry. Crying was a weakness her father had beaten out of her long ago. With trembling hands, Beatrice packed her meager belongings. A few plain, high-collared dresses, heavy wool stockings, a pair of sturdy boots, and her beloved books. As the sun crept over the horizon the next morning, casting a pale, cold light over Denver, she climbed into the back of a canvas-covered supply wagon. She wore a heavy black mourning veil over her face, a final insistence from Clara, so the neighbors wouldn't see the ugly daughter leaving. The driver cracked his whip, and Beatrice Caldwell began her ascent into the unknown, bracing herself for a monster far worse than the one she was leaving behind. The journey into the San Juan Mountains was a grueling, bone-rattling ordeal that lasted 4 brutal days. The driver, a hired roughneck named Ezekiel Moore, spoke barely 10 words to her the entire trip. As the wagon groaned its way up the treacherous, winding switchbacks, the civilized world of Denver vanished, replaced by an imposing wilderness of jagged, snow-capped peaks and dense, seemingly infinite forests of black pine. The air grew progressively thinner and sharper, biting at Beatrice's skin through her heavy woolen cloak. Inside the jolting wagon, her mind raced with terrifying images of her new husband. In the books she had read, mountain men were depicted as savage, unwashed brutes who lived like wolves. Given her father's cruelty, she expected to be treated as a slave, someone to endure his drunken rages and labor until she dropped dead in the snow. She clutched her small carpet bag to her chest, the heavy veil suffocating her, yet offering a necessary shield against the world. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the wagon finally lurched to a halt in a clearing, surrounded by towering spruces. "End of the line, miss," Ezekiel grunted, not bothering to help her down. He tossed her 2 heavy trunks onto the frozen, packed dirt. Beatrice climbed down awkwardly, her legs numb from the cold and the journey. She turned and saw the cabin. It was not a primitive hovel, to her surprise. It was a large, masterfully built log structure with a heavy stone chimney pluming thick, white wood smoke into the crisp blue sky. A sprawling porch ran along the front, stacked high with perfectly chopped firewood. The heavy wooden door opened. Beatrice's breath hitched in her throat. Gideon Hayes stepped out onto the porch. He was massive, moving with the quiet, deliberate grace of a large predator. He wore buckskin trousers, a heavy woolen coat, and held a Winchester rifle casually by his side. A massive timber wolf-dog hybrid trotted out behind him, sitting attentively at his boots. Gideon's gaze swept over the wagon, lingering on the small, trembling figure cloaked in black. Ezekiel tipped his hat nervously. "Delivery for Mr. Hayes. Silas Caldwell sends his regards." Without waiting for a reply, the Hay whipped the horses, eager to descend the mountain before nightfall. The wagon rattled away, the sound fading until there was nothing left but the whispering wind through the pines and the profound, heavy silence of the wilderness. Beatrice stood frozen, a solitary black figure against the white snow, terrified to move. Gideon walked slowly down the porch steps, the snow crunching beneath his heavy boots. He stopped a few feet from her. Up close, his presence was overwhelming. Yet, when he spoke, his voice was not the guttural bark she expected. It was a deep, resonant baritone, surprisingly calm. "You must be Beatrice." "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice trembling. Gideon frowned slightly. "You don't need to call me sir. I'm Gideon. You're freezing. Let's get you inside before the wind picks up." He effortlessly hoisted her 2 heavy trunks, one onto each shoulder, as if they weighed no more than feather pillows. He gestured toward the door with a nod of his head. Beatrice followed him inside. The interior of the cabin was a revelation. It was warm, impeccably clean, and smelled richly of roasted meat, sage, and cedar. Cast iron pots hung neatly over a massive stone hearth where a fire roared merrily. Braided rag rugs covered the polished wooden floorboards. It was vastly different from the cold, intimidating luxury of her father's mansion. This place felt alive, grounded, and safe. Gideon set her trunks down near a large, comfortable-looking bed tucked into the corner of the room, separated from the main living area by a thick tapestry curtain. He turned back to her, wiping his hands on his trousers. "You can take your coat off, Beatrice. The fire will warm you up. And you can take that veil off, too. There's no dust in here." Panic seized her. The veil. She had worn it so long, she felt naked without it. This was the moment. This was when the bargain would shatter, when he would see her face, realize he had been cheated, and throw her out into the snow to die. Her hands shook violently as she reached for the pins holding the heavy black mesh in place. She unpinned it and let the fabric fall to the floor. Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head slightly so the ruined, scarred left side of her face was fully exposed to the firelight. She braced her muscles, waiting for the gasp of horror, the angry shouts, the inevitable cruelty. Silence stretched in the cabin. The only sound was the crackle of the burning pine logs. When she finally found the courage to open her right eye, she saw Gideon standing perfectly still. He was looking at her face, his gray eyes tracing the jagged, shiny ridges of the scar tissue. But there was no revulsion in his expression, no disgust. Instead, his jaw tightened, and a hard, dangerous fury flashed in his eyes, not directed at her, but looking past her, as if he could see Silas Caldwell standing in the room. "Your father," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "He told me you were plain. He told me you were sturdy, kept out of society because you lacked manners." Beatrice swallowed hard, tears finally spilling hot down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she choked out, stepping back. "I'm so sorry. I know I am a monster to look upon. If you want to send me back, or put me out, I will understand." Gideon closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. She flinched, preparing for a blow. Instead, his large, calloused hand gently caught a tear before it could fall from her unscarred cheek. His touch was incredibly warm and surprisingly soft. "A monster?" he repeated, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "Beatrice, you look like a survivor. I've seen men mauled by bears who didn't carry their scars half as bravely as you carry yours." He let his hand fall away, his expression hardening again as he thought of Silas. "He didn't send you up here because you were tough. He sent you up here because he was ashamed, and he wanted my timber." He traded his own flesh and blood like a broken wagon wheel. Gideon let out a breath, running a hand through his thick hair. "I am sorry, Beatrice. I am sorry for the part I played in his cruelty. I asked for a partner, not knowing I was buying a prisoner." Beatrice stared at him, utterly stunned. No one, not in 10 years, had looked at her face and seen anything but a tragedy or a horror. "Come," Gideon said gently, gesturing to the heavy oak dining table. "You've been riding for days. Sit. I made venison stew." That evening, a fierce blizzard swept over Timberline Ridge, howling against the thick log walls like a legion of angry ghosts. Inside, Beatrice sat at the table, eating the best meal she had tasted in years, enveloped in a warmth she had never known. As the night deepened, her anxiety returned. There was only one bed in the cabin. She was, legally, his wife. Gideon seemed to read her mind. He walked over to a heavy wooden chest, pulled out a thick stack of wool blankets and a bear pelt, and began making a pallet on the floor in front of the hearth. "The bed is yours, Beatrice," he said, without looking up. "But where will you sleep?" she asked, her voice timid. "By the fire," he replied, settling onto the heavy fur. He looked over at her, the dancing flames reflecting in his steady gray eyes. "I know how this world works, and I know what your father probably told you, but I am not him. You are safe in this house. You have my name, which means no one can ever touch you again. Not even me, unless you ask it of me. Good night, Beatrice." As the wind screamed outside, Beatrice lay in the soft, massive bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in her life, the scarred, unwanted daughter of Silas Caldwell closed her eyes and felt a strange, terrifying new emotion bloom in her chest. Hope. The first weeks on Black Bear Ridge were a revelation to Beatrice. The brutal, howling winter of the Colorado Rockies was unforgiving, yet inside the stout log walls of Gideon's cabin, a profound peace settled over her. For the first time since she was a little girl, she wasn't a secret to be hidden away, or a burden to be resented. She was simply Beatrice. Gideon proved to be a man of immense patience and few but meaningful words. He did not treat her like a fragile, broken thing. Instead, he treated her like a capable partner. He taught her how to bake sourdough bread in the heavy iron Dutch oven, how to smoke venison, and how to read the sky for incoming snows. When he realized she had a sharp, hungry mind starved by years of confinement in her father's house, he gave her free rein of a small, surprisingly well-stocked bookshelf left by his uncle. Most importantly, Gideon never once averted his gaze from her face. In Denver, at the rare family dinners where she was permitted to sit at the far end of the table, her stepmother Clara would purposefully place tall floral arrangements to block Beatrice from view. Gideon, conversely, would sit across from her by the hearth fire, mending harnesses or whittling, his eyes meeting hers with steady, unwavering warmth. As the deep freeze of January set in, isolating them completely from the world below, the invisible wall between them began to crumble. One bitter evening, a rogue mountain lion, desperate and starved by the deep snows, began stalking the small barn where Gideon kept his 2 draft horses. The frantic whinnying pierced the silence of the night. Gideon grabbed his Winchester rifle and a lantern, charging out into the driving snow. Beatrice paced the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. Then, a sharp crack of gunfire echoed over the howling wind, followed by a terrifying, guttural roar. And then, silence. Unable to simply wait, Beatrice threw on her heavy wool coat, grabbed Gideon's backup revolver, and plunged into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. But she pushed through the knee-deep drifts toward the barn. She found Gideon inside, leaning heavily against a stall. The massive mountain lion lay dead at his feet, but Gideon's left arm was torn open from shoulder to elbow, his thick coat shredded by the beast's claws in its dying thrash. He was losing blood rapidly. "Gideon!" she cried out, rushing to his side and catching him as his knees buckled. "I'm all right, B," he grunted through gritted teeth, his face pale. "Just a scratch." With a strength she didn't know she possessed, Beatrice hauled his massive frame back across the snowy yard and into the cabin. She laid him on the large bed, tearing away the bloody fabric of his sleeve. The sight of the deep, jagged lacerations would have sent the high society women of Denver into a swoon, but Beatrice's hands were remarkably steady. She fetched boiling water, clean linen, and a bottle of strong rye whiskey. "This is going to burn," she warned softly, her eyes meeting his. "Do it," he rasped. She cleaned and stitched the wound with a meticulous, gentle precision, drawing on the years she had spent quietly patching up her own torn dresses and tending to the estate's injured hunting dogs when no one else would. When she finished binding his arm, she collapsed into the chair beside the bed, exhausted, her hands trembling from the adrenaline drop. Gideon reached out with his uninjured right hand, gently wrapping his thick fingers around her small, shaking ones. "You didn't run?" he murmured, his eyes heavy but fiercely bright. "You came out into the storm for me." "You are my husband," she whispered, the word feeling both strange and right on her tongue. "I wouldn't leave you." Gideon slowly pulled her hand toward him, pressing his lips to her knuckles. Then he reached up, his rough thumb lightly tracing the edge of the scar on her cheek. Beatrice stiffened, her old instincts screaming at her to hide, to pull away. But his touch was reverent. "I love this face," he said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that reached straight to her soul. "I love the woman behind it. You are the bravest, most beautiful thing I have ever known, Beatrice Hayes." Tears blurred her vision. She leaned down, burying her face against his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. That night, she didn't return to the chair. She curled up beside him, his uninjured arm wrapped protectively around her waist. The marriage, born of a cruel business transaction, was finally sealed by a profound, undeniable love. Spring arrived on Black Bear Ridge with a violent, beautiful urgency. The snowmelt turned the mountain creeks into roaring torrents, and vibrant columbines bloomed in the clearings. Beatrice had blossomed alongside the mountain. Her pale, gaunt frame had filled out, her skin was tanned by the high-altitude sun, and she moved with a confident, joyful grace. She was deeply, unequivocally in love, and for the first time in her 26 years, she was happy. But in Denver, the shadows were gathering. Silas Caldwell was not a man who accepted compromise. While dining with the legendary silver tycoon Horace Tabor at the opulent Windsor Hotel, a place reeking of cigar smoke and corrupt political deals, Silas realized that the lower 40 acres of Black Bear Ridge were insufficient. The railroad expansion required double the timber. Silas needed the entire mountain, and he had realized a fatal flaw in his contract with Gideon Hayes. By late May, the muddy mountain pass became traversable. Beatrice was out on the porch, hanging freshly washed linen in the bright sunshine, when she heard the heavy clatter of hooves and the creak of leather. A posse of 5 men rode into the clearing. Leading them was Josiah Cobb, Silas Caldwell's ruthless foreman. Cobb was a cruel man with dead eyes, and a reputation for breaking strikes and breaking bones. Beside him rode a nervous-looking man in a sharp city suit, clutching a leather briefcase. Beatrice dropped the linen, her blood running cold. Gideon emerged from the barn, an axe resting casually on his shoulder. He took one look at the men and stepped in front of the cabin, shielding Beatrice from their view. His jaw was set like granite. "You're trespassing, Cobb," Gideon called out, his voice echoing in the quiet valley. "State your business and ride out." Josiah Cobb sneered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Don't be so hostile, Hayes. We're just here to deliver some legal tidings from your father-in-law." Cobb gestured to the nervous man in the suit. "This here is Mr. Finch, attorney at law. He's carrying an order signed by Judge Moses Hallett himself." Gideon didn't flinch. "I have a contract, signed and notarized. Silas has his lower 40. "Ah, about that contract," Finch stammered, adjusting his spectacles. "Mr. Caldwell is filing for an annulment of the marriage. He is claiming that the union was never consummated, and that his daughter is mentally unfit to enter into a legally binding contract. If the marriage is annulled, the timber exchange is voided. Mr. Caldwell is claiming eminent domain for the railroad on the entirety of Black Bear Ridge." Beatrice stepped out from behind Gideon, her hands balled into fists. The fear she used to feel when her father's men were near was gone, replaced by a scorching, protective fury. "My father is a liar," Beatrice said loudly, her voice ringing clear. Cobb looked at her, blinking in surprise. He had expected to find the cowering, veiled phantom of the Caldwell house. Instead, he saw a fierce, radiant woman standing tall beside the mountain man, her scarred face held high and unashamed. "Well, well," Cobb chuckled darkly. "The ugly duckling learned how to quack. It don't matter what you say, girlie. The judge in Denver owes your daddy a lot of money. The law is on Silas's side. You're coming back to Denver, Beatrice. You're being committed to the state asylum for your hysteria, and Hayes here is being evicted." Gideon smoothly lowered the axe and, in one fluid motion, drew the heavy Colt revolver from his hip, aiming it squarely at Cobb's chest. The click of the hammer being pulled back sounded like a cannon shot. "You take one more step toward my wife," Gideon said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "and they'll be burying you under the pines." The 4 hired guns behind Cobb instinctively reached for their holsters. The tension in the clearing snapped tight, heavy, and dangerous. "You can't shoot all of us, Hayes," Cobb warned, though a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "And even if you do, Silas will just send 20 more. He wants this mountain, and he wants his embarrassment of a daughter locked away where society can't see her. You can't fight Silas Caldwell's money." "I don't need to fight his money," Gideon replied softly. "I just need to fight you." Beatrice stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Gideon's gun arm. She looked directly at Josiah Cobb, her eyes blazing with a cunning intelligence she had inherited from her father, but refined in the purity of the mountains. "Mr. Finch," Beatrice called out to the sweating lawyer, "does Judge Hallett know that my father bribed the land surveyor to falsify the boundaries of the lower 40? Or that my father embezzled funds from the Colorado Midland Railway investors to pay for his new mansion? Because I kept his ledgers. For 10 years I sat in the shadows of his study, and I read every single document." Finch went completely pale. Cobb's sneer vanished. Beatrice smiled, and for the first time her scar seemed to catch the sunlight like a badge of honor. "Tell my father," she commanded, "that if he ever sends men to my home again, or attempts to steal my husband's land, I will take a train down to Denver. I will walk into the offices of the Rocky Mountain News, veil completely removed, and I will hand them a written, detailed account of exactly where Silas Caldwell hides his stolen money. He won't just lose this mountain. He will lose everything." Cobb stared at her, realizing with a sinking dread that the vulnerable girl Silas had thrown away was now holding a loaded gun to the Empire's head. He looked at Gideon's unwavering Colt, then at Beatrice's iron gaze. "Turn the horses around," Cobb spat at his men. He shot one last venomous glare at Gideon. "This ain't over, Hayes." "It is," Gideon replied. "Get off my ridge." They watched as the posse rode back down the trail, disappearing into the dense timber. Gideon holstered his weapon and turned to Beatrice, a look of profound awe on his face. He wrapped his massive arms around her, lifting her off her feet and burying his face in her neck. "You," he whispered, a smile breaking through his beard, "are far more dangerous than a mountain lion." But even as they held each other, Beatrice looked down the winding trail. She had won the battle, but she knew her father. Silas Caldwell was a proud, vindictive man. Cornered animals were the most dangerous, and she knew he would not let his empire be threatened by the daughter he had thrown away. The real storm was just beginning. The golden warmth of summer yielded to autumn's bitter winds. Beatrice knew her father wouldn't surrender. Silas Caldwell demanded absolute control, and her defiance was a humiliation he couldn't abide. Anticipating his wrath, Beatrice didn't wait. When a trusted French-Canadian trapper passed through, she handed him a heavy leather pouch. Inside was a 50-page manuscript detailing every bribe and stolen railroad bond her father had orchestrated. It was addressed to the Rocky Mountain News, a dead man's switch. By late October, Gideon had transformed the homestead into a fortress. He boarded windows, stocked ammunition, and rigged perimeter tripwires. The attack came at midnight under a pale moon. A sharp crack echoed through the timberline, a tripwire blank detonating. Gideon rolled out of bed, tossing Beatrice a heavy coat. "Stay low," he ordered, grabbing his Winchester. "We fight together," she countered, cocking the heavy Colt he'd taught her to fire. Gideon nodded, a fierce pride flashing in his eyes. Gunfire erupted. A hail of lead tore through the cabin's wooden shutters. Silas hadn't sent his foreman this time. He'd hired Harlan Cross, a ruthless ex-Pinkerton, and a dozen mercenaries. Gideon moved to a gun port, firing into the darkness. A cry confirmed a hit. Beatrice aimed through a knothole, firing blindly into the brush to push back the flank. Realizing a direct assault was suicide, Cross changed tactics. "Burn them out!" he roared. Flaming arrows slammed into the dry pine shingles. Within minutes, the roof glowed a hellish orange, and choking black smoke filled the cabin. Burning embers rained down upon them. "Out the back window!" Gideon shouted over the roaring flames. "On three!" They vaulted through the shattered rear window, hitting the frozen ground and scrambling up the steep, rocky shale behind the cabin. Bullets chipped the granite at their heels as they climbed desperately toward a high, concealed ledge. Below, the cabin's roof caved in, sending a tragic plume of sparks into the sky. The mercenaries stepped cautiously into the illuminated clearing. Then, stepping from the tree line, flanked by guards, was Silas Caldwell. He wore a thick fur coat, his face twisted in a mask of pure fury. He had come to watch his daughter break. "Find them!" Silas screamed, his voice cracking with rage. "I want them dead!" Looking down at the man who had kept her a prisoner for a decade, Beatrice felt no fear, only cold resolve. Beside her, Gideon pulled 3 thick sticks of mining dynamite from his canvas sack. He looked at the steep, snow-packed overhang directly above the mercenaries. "It'll bring half the mountain down," he whispered, holding out a match. "Your father is down there, Bee." Beatrice didn't hesitate. She took the match, struck it, and touched the flame to the fuses. With a powerful heave, Gideon hurled the explosives high into the air, aiming for the unstable boulders above her father's position. "Cover your ears!" he yelled, pulling her flat against the stone. The blast was apocalyptic. It shattered the structural integrity of the heavy snowpack and loose granite. The mountain roared. Tons of rock, earth, and ice broke loose, cascading downward in a violent, unstoppable avalanche. Down in the clearing, the mercenaries scattered blindly. Silas Caldwell stood frozen, his eyes wide in absolute terror, his immense wealth entirely useless against the unforgiving wrath of the wilderness. The landslide swept over the burning cabin, burying the clearing under 30 feet of rock and silencing the gunfire instantly. When dawn broke, painting the peaks in soft pinks and golds, Gideon and Beatrice climbed down to the devastated landscape. The mercenaries who survived the periphery had fled. Silas Caldwell was gone, entombed by the mountain he had tried to steal. 2 days later, the trusted trapper returned with a detachment of U.S. Marshals. News of the siege wasn't needed. Beatrice's ledgers had already blown Denver apart. Warrants had been issued. Silas's empire was legally and financially ruined. The head marshal surveyed the wreckage, tipping his hat to Beatrice. The mountain handed down its own verdict. Your testimony freed a lot of people from his grip, Mrs. Hayes. Beatrice smiled, her scar catching the sunlight. I had an excellent teacher in bravery, she said, squeezing Gideon's hand. 3 years later, Black Bear Ridge echoed with the sounds of ringing axes and laughter. The cabin had been rebuilt larger and filled with sunlight. Beatrice never wore a veil again, revered by the locals who knew her story. On a warm summer evening, she sat on the porch, holding her sleeping infant son. Gideon walked up the steps, leaning down to kiss her. His thumb gently traced the beloved scar on her cheek. Looking out over the untouched expanse of the Rockies, Beatrice rested her head against her husband's arm. She was the queen of Black Bear Ridge, and she was loved like no other. The explosion was apocalyptic. The concussive blast shook the very foundation of the Rockies, deafening in its sheer raw power. But the explosion was only the catalyst. The dynamite shattered the structural integrity of the heavy snowpack and the loose granite shale above the clearing. A deep, terrifying groan echoed through the valley. Then the mountain roared. Tons of rock, earth, and ice broke loose, cascading downward in a violent, unstoppable avalanche. Down in the clearing, Harlan Cross and his mercenaries looked up just in time to see the mountain falling upon them. Panic erupted. Men scattered blindly into the woods. Silas Caldwell stood frozen, his eyes wide in absolute terror, his immense wealth and power entirely useless against the unforgiving wrath of the wilderness. The landslide swept over the burning cabin and the clearing in a matter of seconds, burying the embers and silencing the gunfire. When the dust and snow finally settled, the valley was cloaked in an eerie, profound silence. Beatrice and Gideon slowly stood up, looking down at the devastated landscape. The clearing was gone, buried under 30 feet of rock and snow. Silas Caldwell's ruthless pursuit had ended at the bottom of the mountain he had so desperately tried to steal. When dawn broke, painting the snow-capped peaks in soft hues of pink and gold, Gideon and Beatrice climbed back down. The mercenaries who had survived the periphery of the landslide had fled into the woods, abandoning their doomed contract. There was no sign of Silas Caldwell, nor Harlan Cross. 2 days later, Jacques Lefebvre returned to the ridge, accompanied by an absolute force of nature, a detachment of United States Marshals. News of the siege had not been necessary to bring them. The moment William Byers in Denver had received Beatrice's manuscript, the city had erupted in scandal. The Rocky Mountain News ran a front-page exposé on Silas Caldwell's corruption, his embezzlement of railroad funds, and the illegal seizure of public and private lands. Warrants had been issued for his immediate arrest, and federal marshals had tracked his posse up into the mountains. When the head marshal saw the wreckage of the landslide, he took off his hat, looking at Gideon and Beatrice, who stood hand in hand, soot-stained but unbroken. "It seems the mountain handed down its own verdict, Mr. Hayes," the marshal said gruffly. "Silas Caldwell's estate is being seized by the federal government. His accounts are frozen. The man is legally, financially, and quite literally ruined." The marshal tipped his hat to Beatrice. "Your testimony in those ledgers was the bravest thing I've ever read, Mrs. Hayes. You freed a lot of people from his grip." Beatrice smiled. A genuine, radiant smile that made the scar on her face look like a constellation of pure strength. "I had an excellent teacher in bravery," she said, squeezing Gideon's hand. Epilogue. 3 years later, Black Bear Ridge was alive with the sounds of ringing axes and laughter. The cabin had been rebuilt larger, sturdier, and filled with sunlight. The timber rights were firmly in Gideon's name, but he didn't clear-cut the mountain. He selectively logged, preserving the wild beauty of the land that had saved them. Beatrice Hayes became a legend in her own right. She never wore a veil again. She frequently traveled down to the mining towns to trade, her head held high, respected and revered by the locals who knew the story of the woman who brought down a corrupt baron. On a warm summer evening, Beatrice sat on the sprawling front porch. A thick, woven blanket draped over her lap. In her arms, she held a sleeping infant with a tuft of thick, dark auburn hair. Gideon walked up the steps, his axe over his shoulder, the massive wolf dog trotting happily at his heels. He leaned down, kissing his wife softly, his thumb gently tracing the familiar, beloved scar on her cheek, before resting his hand gently on his sleeping son's head. "It's a beautiful evening," Gideon murmured, looking out over the vast, untouched expanse of the Rockies. "It is," Beatrice agreed, resting her head against his strong arm. She looked at the mountain, then at her husband, knowing that she had finally found exactly where she belonged. She wasn't an ugly duckling. She wasn't a broken thing. She was the queen of Black Bear Ridge, and she was loved like no other. If Beatrice and Gideon's incredible journey of survival, true love, and frontier justice kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit that like button. Share this video with fellow history and romance lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life, Wild West stories. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a tale of courage in the untamed frontier. See you next time.